My name is Commander Emily Carter, U.S. Navy SEAL. And on my wedding day, there were 142 guests, yet not a single one of them was family. When the church doors opened, the sunlight spilled across the aisle like a stage light. The organ began to play, and everyone turned. Cameras, whispers, smiles, except the front 3 pews where I'd reserved seats for my parents and my brother. They sat empty, lined with white ribbons that never got touched. I walked down the aisle alone. No father's arm, no guiding step, just the click of my shoes on the marble and the steady rhythm of my breath. Years of command training had taught me how to keep composure under pressure. Still, when I glanced toward those empty seats, something inside me faltered. I fixed my eyes ahead on David, the man waiting for me at the altar. He smiled. He was calm, the kind of calm that comes from building engines for a living. David never served in the military, but he understood structure, reliability, and quiet courage. That was enough. When I reached him, he took my hand, and for a moment, I forgot every absence in the room. The ceremony moved like clockwork. The chaplain and old Navy friend spoke softly about loyalty and endurance. Every word carried double weight for me, loyalty and battle endurance in family. When it came time for the vows, my voice didn't shake. I'd promised my country everything before. Promising David felt simple in comparison. After the applause, the music, and the line of guests shaking our hands, the night blurred into laughter and champagne. David's family danced. His mother hugged me and whispered, "You have us now." It was meant as comfort, but it stung more than it healed. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting my father to walk in late, making an entrance with some excuse about traffic. He didn't. Neither did my mother nor my brother, whose last text months ago simply said, "Don't expect much from us." Later, when the guests were gone, David and I sat on the hotel balcony overlooking the harbor. Ships glowed in the distance, engines humming low against the night. I sipped champagne, but it tasted like salt. My phone sat on the table, screen dark, still waiting for a message that wouldn't come. David said softly, "You don't have to keep waiting, Em." "I know," I said, though I didn't. In the Navy, you learn to expect the worst, but still prepare for the best. I'd hoped maybe they'd change their minds. He put his hand over mine. Family isn't about who's supposed to show up. It's about who actually does. I smiled at him, but when he turned away, my eyes filled with tears that I refused to let fall. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains. I sat by the window, still in the silk robe the hotel had given us, and looked down at the harbor again. It was peaceful, the kind of morning that almost convinces you pain was just a dream. But then I saw the folded invitation on the table, the one addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Carter and family, untouched. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the embossed letters, then folded it once more and slipped it into my uniform jacket. Some reminders need to hurt. They keep you honest. We spent the next week traveling along the coast, visiting old shipyards and quiet diners. David loved small towns. I loved watching him talk to strangers as if everyone had a story worth knowing. For a while, I forgot about my family. But when we returned home to Norfolk, the silence greeted me again. I hadn't realized how heavy silence could be until it became the only thing my parents gave me. Days passed. I threw myself into work, training recruits, reviewing logistics reports, mentoring younger officers who reminded me of myself a decade ago. Discipline was easier than grief. Still, at night when David fell asleep, I'd scroll through old photos, my brother's graduation, my parents' anniversary dinner, the Thanksgiving before my first deployment. Every image had me in uniform, smiling too wide, trying too hard. I wondered if that was when they started resenting me, when my achievements became a mirror for everything my brother wasn't. I never disobeyed my father growing up. He was a school principal, strict, respected, proud. When I enlisted, he said, "The military is no place for a girl." When I came home as a decorated SEAL officer, he said, "Don't get cocky." When I got promoted, he didn't say anything at all. So maybe I should have expected the empty seats. Maybe that was his final lesson, silence as punishment. One night I tried calling him anyway. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I left a simple message. "Hi, Dad. Just wanted you to know the wedding went fine. I'm doing okay." I hung up before my voice could crack. A few days later, I received a card from one of my Navy teammates who'd attended. It read, "You stood taller walking alone than most people do with an army behind them." That line stayed with me. It wasn't pride I felt, just confirmation that I hadn't imagined the loneliness. David found the card on my desk and read it quietly. "You really did walk alone, huh?" "Yeah," I said, "and I guess I'll keep doing it." He shook his head. "No, you won't. You've got me now. You've got a home." For the first time, I believed him. I thought maybe, just maybe, the silence from my family would fade into background noise, a wound that wouldn't reopen. I was wrong. Because weeks later, when I least expected it, the silence broke with a single message from my father. A text so absurd, so audacious, that I had to read it twice to believe it. "Need $8,400 for your brother's wedding. You've always been the responsible one." I stared at the screen, my mouth half open. After months of nothing, not a call, not a congratulations, he reached out to ask for money for my brother's wedding. David looked over my shoulder. "You're kidding." "No," I said. "This is real." I put the phone down and laughed, short, bitter, almost hysterical. It wasn't humor. It was disbelief made loud, the kind of laugh you use when words won't do. David said quietly, "What are you going to do?" I stared at the phone for a long time. Then I picked it up, opened my banking app, and sent exactly $1. The note read, "Best wishes." Then I blocked the number, turned to David and said, "Change the locks tomorrow." He nodded without a question. Because in our house, silence wasn't danger anymore. It was peace. The morning after I sent that $1 transfer, I half expected the world to react. A phone call, a slammed door, a storm. But the sky stayed still, calm and gray above Norfolk. David left early for work, coffee in hand, and kissed my forehead like nothing had happened. I sat by the window with my laptop open, pretending to review a supply report, but my eyes kept drifting to the phone on the table. The blocked number mocked me, sitting there in quiet defiance. My father had raised me to be obedient, disciplined, but he'd forgotten that discipline cuts both ways. By noon, I unblocked him, not because I wanted to talk, but because silence had started to hum louder than any message. 2 minutes later, a new text appeared. "That's funny. Didn't think you'd be so petty. Your brother's wedding is next month. Don't embarrass us again." I read it twice. Petty. That word hit harder than I thought. It wasn't the insult. It was the casual cruelty. Like everything between us had been reduced to a bill. I typed a dozen replies before erasing them all. Every version felt too small or too angry. Then I remembered something my drill instructor once said. Silence is the loudest response to disrespect. So I turned off my phone. That night, David came home to find me polishing my medals, something I hadn't done since before the wedding. "You okay?" he asked gently. "Just keeping them clean." He leaned against the doorway. "You don't have to prove anything to him." "I'm not," I said. "I'm proving it to myself that all this," I gestured at the ribbons and insignia, "wasn't wasted on someone who can't see past his own pride." David smiled softly. "You know, for someone who's been through combat, you're terrible at ignoring landmines." He wasn't wrong. The next few weeks felt strangely lighter. I throw myself into work, training, planning, morning PT at 500. My unit had a new batch of recruits, and their wide eyes reminded me of my younger self, eager, naive, thinking medals could fix what family broke. One afternoon, I was debriefing a logistics meeting when Chief Ramos, my second in command, stopped me in the hallway. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I saw your dad last week." I froze. "Excuse me?" "He was in town. Said he wanted to find out what base you were on. Asked some old Navy contacts." "How do you know that?" Ramos hesitated. "He came by the cafe near the docks, asked about you, said it was family business." I took a slow breath. "You didn't tell him anything, did you?" He shook his head quickly. "Of course not, ma'am." Good. I walked away before he could ask questions. My father had crossed a line, not with the police, not with the money, but with control. The same control he used when I was 16, and he made me cancel prom because my grades dropped by a single point. The same control that made him keep my acceptance letter to Annapolis for 3 weeks before finally handing it over with the words, "You'll regret it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood in the kitchen staring at the fridge light and listening to the rain against the window. David came in quietly, rubbing his eyes. "You're thinking about him again." "I'm trying not to," I said, "but it's like he's trained me to wait for the next order." He leaned on the counter. "Then untrain yourself. You're not his soldier anymore." I smiled faintly. "No, I'm not." The next morning, I went to the base chapel before sunrise. I wasn't there to pray for him, not yet, but to steady myself. The chaplain, an old Marine I'd known since my first deployment, noticed me sitting alone. "Commander Carter," he said, taking the bench beside me. "You look like someone who's fighting a war off the record." I sighed. "How'd you guess?" "Because you're in uniform before 600 and not holding coffee." I smiled despite myself. He waited, then said quietly, "Some battles aren't about victory. They're about survival of the heart." "Feels like I'm losing both." He nodded. "You'll win when you stop needing him to understand." Those words stuck. A week later, I received a handwritten envelope. Not a text, not an email, an actual letter. My father's handwriting, sharp and familiar. "Emily, you've forgotten where you came from. Your brother and I are struggling, and you're out there pretending to be better than us. You can keep your medals. You'll die alone with them. Dad." No greeting, no closing warmth, just that. I folded the letter once, twice, then set it in the kitchen drawer beneath the cutlery. I didn't rip it. I didn't burn it. I just refused to give it ceremony. That evening, I told David everything. The cafe, the letter, the past. He listened quietly, then said, "So, what do you want to do?" "Nothing," I answered. "He wants reaction. I'll give him distance." David nodded, though his brow furrowed. "Distance only works if both sides stop advancing." I looked up. "What do you mean?" "He's already moved toward you once. What if he does it again, louder?" His words lingered in the air. 2 days later, while I was finishing a training brief, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered instinctively. A gruff voice said, "Is this Commander Carter?" "Yes." "This is Officer Grant with Norfolk PD. We're outside your residence with a Mr. Thomas Carter. Says he's your father." My stomach dropped. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "He's reporting a domestic theft," the officer said carefully. "Claims you withdrew family funds without consent. We'd like to clear things up." I closed my eyes. "Stay there. I'm on my way." When I arrived at the gate 20 minutes later, the wind carried the sound of sirens fading in the distance. My father stood between 2 uniformed officers, arms crossed, face red from shouting. David stood beside the porch, quiet and unmoved. The moment my father saw me in uniform, he smirked. "Finally decided to show up, Commander." I took a slow step forward. "You brought police to my house. You stole from your family," he barked. "I want what's ours." I met the officer's eyes. "Gentlemen, this man is confused. Would you like to see my bank statement for the $1 transfer?" They glanced at each other, trying not to laugh. One of them coughed into his sleeve. "Sir," said the older cop to my father, "there's clearly been a misunderstanding." My father's voice cracked. "She's ungrateful!" "Enough," I said sharply, the command tone cutting through him like a whistle. The officers straightened instinctively. David stepped closer. "Sir, I think you should leave now." The officers guided my father back toward the cruiser. As they opened the door, he turned and shouted, "You think your rank makes you right?" I looked straight at him. "No, Dad. It just means I earned my peace." That night, after the police left, David found me sitting at the dining table, hands still trembling slightly. He asked quietly, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said. "I think I finally am." Because sometimes it takes the sound of sirens outside your home to realize you're not the one who's lost control. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The sky over Norfolk was still ink blue, and the air smelled faintly of sea salt and wet asphalt from the night's rain. David was asleep beside me, his breathing slow and steady, but I couldn't rest. I dressed quietly, slipping into my navy blues, and walked outside. The front porch was still damp, the doormat muddy from the police boots that had stood there the night before. My father's voice still echoed faintly in my mind. "You think your rank makes you right?" That tone, that mixture of bitterness and control. It was the same voice that had followed me my whole life. But last night was the first time I'd answered him as an equal, and as a woman who no longer needed his permission to stand tall. Still, a part of me hurt. You don't unlearn 30 years of wanting your father's approval overnight. At 700, I reported to base. Chief Ramos looked up as soon as I entered the operations room. His usual smirk was gone. "Morning, ma'am," he said, cautious. "Heard about what happened." "I'm sure everyone did," I replied, dropping my folder on the table. "Let's get to work." He hesitated. "For what it's worth, the officer ours at the gate said you handled it like a pro." "Good, because that's exactly what I am." We dove into the logistics briefing, but the entire time I felt the weight of unspoken gossip hovering over me. Everyone was polite, respectful even, but I could feel it. The murmurs, the curious glances, the questions no one dared ask. Why would her father call the police on her? At 1100, I excused myself and walked to the base chapel. It was empty except for the chaplain polishing brass candle holders. He looked up. "Rough week, Commander?" I sat in the back pew. "You could say that." "Want to talk about it?" "Not really, but I can't seem to stop replaying it." He nodded knowingly. "Family wounds don't follow rank, do they?" "No, sir," I said quietly. "They outrank everything." By evening, I was home again. David had made dinner, his way of saying, "We're still okay." I tried to eat, but my appetite had vanished. He finally said, "You should probably call your mom. She's been texting me." I looked up sharply. "She texted you?" He nodded, said, "Your dad's embarrassed, but doesn't know how to reach you. She wants to smooth things over." I pushed my plate away. "Smooth things over? He brought police to our door, David." "I know, but maybe she's trying to make peace." "Peace without apology isn't peace," I said flatly. He didn't argue. David had learned that silence was sometimes safer than logic. That night, I dreamt I was 12 again, standing in our old living room, holding a report card with straight A's. My father was watching TV, barely glancing up. When he finally did, he said, "You'll do better next time." Even asleep, I felt that old sting. The next day, I was summoned to the base commander's office. Captain Harris was a graying man with a kind of calm authority that came from years of command and too many cups of black coffee. "Sit down, Carter," he said. "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair. "I got a call this morning from local law enforcement about last night." I froze. "Sir, He raised a hand. "Relax. You're not in trouble. They said you handled yourself professionally, but I wanted to make sure you're holding up. That kind of family situation can rattle even the toughest among us." "I'm fine, sir." He studied me for a long moment. "You remind me of myself at your age. Thought I could out-discipline pain. Turns out, pain doesn't follow orders." His words landed deeper than I expected. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" I asked. He nodded. "I just don't understand how a man can be both father and enemy. Sometimes they start as fathers, and we turn into the soldiers they can't command anymore." That was the truest thing anyone had said to me in years. That evening, I decided to answer my mother's message. It was short. "Mom, I'm safe. Please don't come here. I need space." She replied within minutes. "Your father feels humiliated. He says you made him look weak. Please call." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I locked the phone and tossed it on the counter. David was watching me. "You don't owe them anything, you know." "I know," I said softly, "but part of me still wants to hear him say he's sorry." "Do you really think he will?" I shook my head. "No, he doesn't know how." 2 days later, I was at the base gym when I saw a familiar face walk through the door. Officer Grant, one of the policemen from that night. He spotted me and nodded respectfully. "Commander Carter?" I returned the nod. "Officer, everything all right?" "Yes, ma'am. Just thought you should know your father came by the station again." My stomach tightened. "For what?" "Said he wanted to withdraw the complaint, but he also left this." He handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was my father's handwriting. "You've changed. You think respect is owed, not earned. When you come to your senses, you know where to find us." I folded it neatly, handed it back. "You can keep it." The officer hesitated. "You sure?" "Yes, I've already read every version of that letter my whole life." He nodded and left without another word. I sat down on the bench, elbows on my knees, heart pounding harder than it had during any deployment. Because in that moment, I realized something painful but freeing. My father wasn't angry that I disobeyed him. He was angry that I no longer needed him. That weekend, David and I drove out to the countryside to breathe. The farther we got from Norfolk, the easier it became to think clearly. We stopped at a roadside diner, the kind with faded coffee mugs and old veterans trading stories at the counter. One of them noticed my Navy pin and asked, "You serving, ma'am?" "Yes, sir," I said with a small smile. "Still serving?" He nodded. "Good. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are." It was such a simple line, but it felt like a balm. When we got home that night, I sat on the porch and watched the sunset burn gold across the horizon. David brought me a cup of coffee and sat beside me. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That some people break you because they can't bend," I said quietly. "But I won't break. Not for him." He smiled. "That's my girl." 2 days later, I got an email from the Navy's legal office. It was a courtesy notice. Apparently, my father had filed an informal complaint with the state about psychological harassment and withholding family assets. It had no legal weight, just another attempt to bruise my reputation. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because I'd finally stopped caring. This time, I didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't even call David. I simply wrote a single-sentence reply to the legal officer. "No action required. Family matter resolved." Then I went outside, stood under the afternoon sun, and took the deepest breath I'd taken in years. The air was warm, salty, and honest. For the first time, I felt untouchable. The fallout didn't come right away. It never does. It seeps in quietly, through whispers, through phone calls that stop coming, through family members who suddenly don't want to get involved. About a week after the police incident, I noticed my social media had gone silent. My cousin unfollowed me. An aunt I had always sent Christmas cards to posted something vague online about arrogant children forgetting where they came from. I didn't need to be tagged to know who she meant. Then came the phone calls, not from my parents, but from people who shared their last name. "Emily, honey, maybe just call your dad," Aunt Carol said one morning. "He's been through a lot." I swallowed a bitter laugh. So have I. "Still," she said, her voice soft but edged with judgment, "he's your father." "Exactly," I said. "And fathers don't call the police on their daughters." Then a small sigh. "You're too proud, Emily, just like him." That part hurt, because it was true. On base, the storm reached me in different ways. Chief Ramos began fielding strange calls asking to confirm my service record. Someone, and I didn't have to guess who, was trying to dig into my career. At lunch one day, a young ensign whispered, "Ma'am, my dad saw something about you on Facebook, said you disowned your family after getting rich." I looked at him evenly. "Believe everything you read online, ensign?" He flushed. "No, ma'am." "Good," I said. "Then get back to work." But when he left, I felt the sting all the same. Rumors can outmaneuver even the best trained soldier. That weekend, David suggested we take a drive to clear our heads. We packed sandwiches and headed toward Virginia Beach. It was spring, warm enough for joggers and tourists, but quiet enough for thought. We walked along the boardwalk, the ocean glittering under a mild sun. David bought us lemonade from a vendor and said, "You know what your problem is, Commander." I raised an eyebrow. "Careful, sailor." He chuckled. "You've spent your whole life trying to win wars that can't be won. Your dad's not an enemy you defeat. He's a storm you outlast." I sipped my drink. "Storms still cause damage." "Sure," he said, "but you don't blame the rain for being rain." I stared at the horizon for a long time. He used to be proud of me, you know. When I got accepted into Annapolis, he called me his trailblazer. David nodded. "And then what?" "I think he realized I was blazing a trail he couldn't follow." That night, back home, we found an envelope taped to our mailbox. My stomach tightened before I even touched it. It was from my mother. The handwriting was gentle, careful, as if she feared I'd tear it up. "Emily, I know things have gone too far. Your father is angry, but deep down he's ashamed. He doesn't know how to talk to you anymore. Please, just call us. Love, Mom." No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just a plea for me to make it easy for him again. I folded the letter and set it on the counter. David watched silently from across the kitchen. "You're not calling, are you?" he said. "No," I said softly. "Not until he says the words I've waited 30 years to hear." "I'm proud of you." I shook my head. "I'm sorry." Work became my refuge again. I took extra shifts, volunteered for late-night duty rotations. When you're surrounded by order and hierarchy, pain feels manageable. You can file it, label it, control it. But at night, when I got home, the silence grew louder. David tried to fill it with warmth, dinners, movies, small jokes, but I was too far inside myself. One evening he said, "You know, I married a Navy SEAL, not a ghost." That stopped me cold. "I'm here," I said quietly. He shook his head. "No, you're still in that house with him. You walk around like you're waiting for permission to breathe." "I'm not." "Then breathe, Emily. For once, just live like he doesn't get to write the script." I turned away, blinking fast. "That's harder than it sounds." "I know," he said, his voice softening, "but if anyone can do it, it's you." A few days later, I received a call from the base HR office.
"Commander Carter," the officer said, "we received an anonymous letter alleging misconduct with your family finances. We know it's false, but we had to notify you." I almost laughed.
Let me guess who sent it. I'm sorry, ma'am. We have to file it, but it'll be dismissed. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence. There it was, another attack. But instead of anger, I felt an unexpected calm. This was his last trick, trying to stain what he couldn't control. That night, I went for a long run along the harbor. The air was sharp, the water reflecting city lights like scattered stars. Every step felt like shedding a layer: expectation, guilt, shame. When I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line across the page. Family doesn't mean obedience. It means respect. 2 weeks later, I received a message from an unknown number. "You've turned everyone against me. I hope you're happy." No signature, but I didn't need one. For a long time, I just stared at the words. Then I deleted the message and blocked the number again. After that, I poured myself a cup of tea, went to the porch, and watched the quiet street outside. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed, deep, mournful, fading into distance. I whispered to myself, "Let it go," and for once, I meant it. The next morning, something small but powerful shifted inside me. I woke before my alarm, made breakfast, and packed David's lunch before he even came downstairs. He looked surprised. "You okay?" "I think so," I said, for the first time in a while. "So what changed?" "I stopped fighting ghosts," I said simply. "They can't hear you anyway." That Sunday, I went back to church for the first time since the wedding. I sat in the back pew and listened. Not for forgiveness, not for guidance, just for silence. And in that silence, I found something that felt almost like peace. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their apology. I only needed to believe I was enough as I was. And for the first time, I did. Summer came to Norfolk, heavy with heat and forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. The air smelled of cut grass and tar warming on the roads. David and I settled into small routines. Saturdays at the farmer's market, weeknights walking past the harbor until the sky went lavender. I wore my hair down more, laughed easier, learned the names of the older couple next door who waved from their porch swing at dusk. Peace had a shape now. It looked like ordinary life. Then the pastor from my hometown called. I recognized his number before I answered. I hadn't spoken to him since before the wedding, since the premarital counseling he'd offered over coffee and scripture and common sense. Back then, he'd asked kindly if I thought my father would attend. I'd said yes. I'd believed it, like sunrise. "Commander Carter," he said, slipping my rank between nostalgia and respect. "Do you have a minute?" "I do," I said, steadying my voice against whatever news he carried. "I hate to be the one to tell you," he said, "but your brother's wedding has been postponed, possibly canceled." I sank into a kitchen chair and stared at the refrigerator, at a postcard of the Atlantic pressed under a magnet shaped like an anchor. "Why?" Well, he paused, choosing the gentlest path. "There's debt. More than the fiancé knew. Some past due accounts, a car he said he owned outright, but he doesn't, and another person who believes she's engaged to him, too." I let out a breath that felt like a confession. That sounds like him. "I'm not calling to gossip," the pastor added. "Your father's business is also in trouble. Tax liens, a contractor who wasn't paid. He's proud, Emily." "Too proud to ask for help? He says he's the injured party, but I think he's drowning." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Nothing you can't live with," he said. "Sometimes all a storm needs is a dry place to pass over." He paused, then added softly, "Would you consider praying for him?" "Not so he changes."
So you do. After we hung up, I stared out the window at the road shimmering in the heat. Somewhere a lawnmower droned. A child laughed 2 houses down. I wasn't a saint. I wasn't even a regular at church. But I folded my hands on the table and whispered a clumsy prayer anyway. Half plea, half surrender. God, I don't want him hurt, I said into the quiet. I just want him to stop hurting me. That evening, I told David. He set 2 plates on the table and listened without interrupting, the way he does when a machine is speaking in clicks no one else can hear. So, he said gently, do you feel like driving down there, seeing him? I shook my head. If I go now, I'll be the bailout, and I won't be that again. You're allowed to protect yourself, he said. Protection isn't revenge, it's stewardship. I smiled at the word. It made my heart sound like something I could manage. Balance sheets and maintenance schedules, not open wounds. A week later, another letter arrived, this one in my mother's slanted hand. She wrote that my brother's fiancé had moved out of their apartment. She wrote that vendors were calling the house. She wrote that the bank had some concerns. Between the lines, she wrote that she was scared. I read it on the back steps while the evening cooled and the azaleas along the fence shook with a breeze. I could see my mother's face as clearly as if she were across from me. The neat lipstick, the quiet eyes that always looked down before they looked up. She was expert at pretending a crisis was merely a complicated errand. I loved her, and I resented her for making me hold the whole world steady. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because every reply from me had become a confession. I'll fix it. I had to unlearn that habit, like a bad trigger squeeze. Days stretched, Norfolk summers. Storms rolled through at regular intervals. Fat drops, fast thunder, steam curling off the street afterward. I ran in the rain one afternoon and thought about a day 20 years earlier, the first summer my father let me help fix the fence behind our house. He'd handed me a post hole digger as if it were a ceremonial sword. Keep the line straight, he'd said, pointing down a string he'd staked between 2 corners. The air had been full of honeysuckle and wet dirt. I remember his big hand steadying the cedar post as we packed soil back around it. He'd shown me how to sight the level, how to read the bubble, how to correct for a slight lean. When we'd finished, he'd wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and surveyed our work like a king. Then he'd looked at me, not through me, not around me, and said, "Good, that'll hold." I sat on the curb outside our house in Norfolk, slick with rain and memory, and I cried for the girl who believed that sentence meant I would hold. For years I had. I'd been the level, the line, the steady weight against the lean. But fences can't hold everything. Neither can daughters. The pastor called again 2 weeks later. "Your father asked me to tell you he wants to talk. He said he won't say he's sorry. He asked me not to say that on his behalf, but he did ask me to tell you he's tired." Tired? The man I knew was powered by pride and caffeine and the conviction that other people's feelings were overdramatic. The word didn't fit his shape. It startled me. "Thank you," I told the pastor, "for being the bridge without pushing me across." He chuckled softly. Bridges just stand. People decide if they walk. Some nights I felt the tug to drive down, to stand across from my father in the kitchen where I'd done homework while he graded papers. I could have told him about the recruits I was mentoring, about the girl from Kansas who'd broken her mile time, about the boy from Maine who wrote home every Sunday and called his grandmother before lights out. I could have handed him a stack of evidence that I'd built a life both gentle and strong. I could have asked him to be proud, just once. Instead, I wrote a single postcard. The lighthouse at Cape Henry, a slash of white against blue. On the back I wrote, "Thinking of you." I didn't sign it. Love. Didn't add my return address. I addressed it to my mother. I knew she would show him. and I knew he wouldn't know what to do with a message that didn't give instructions. A month later, I got the news the way you get most news now, third hand, on a weekday, between tasks. My cousin messaged that my brother's wedding was officially canceled. "He's in a bad place," she wrote. "Don't kick him while he's down." I stared at the screen, feeling no triumph, no relief, only a tired ache for a boy who had grown up learning that somebody else would pay. We'd both inherited a ledger. His ink ran to debts, mine to obligations. Maybe we were the same lesson written in two languages. That evening, David found me folding laundry with the kind of furious care reserved for grief. He took a shirt from my hands and said, "Let it wrinkle." I laughed, and the sound surprised me. Then I said, "Do you think I'm hard-hearted?" He shook his head. "I think you're learning to put your heart where people can't trample it." We sat on the floor with clean towels piled around us like small, soft barricades. The house was quiet. Even the clock seemed slower. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch. The sky over Norfolk was clear, stars sharp. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded, long, low, certain. I closed my eyes and pictured that old fence again, the level bubble finding center, the cedar post settling into the earth. "Hold," I whispered to myself. "You'll hold." And for the first time, holding didn't mean bearing someone else's weight. It meant standing where I'd planted myself and letting the storm pass, not as punishment, but as weather. When I finally went inside, David was already asleep, one arm flung over my side of the bed like a promise. I lay down gently and listened to his breathing until mine matched it. Somewhere between waking and sleep, I said a quiet prayer that didn't ask for victory or apology, only for the kind of mercy that looks like wisdom. If there's an education older Americans understand, it's that some lessons arrive slow and stay forever. Mine had. Boundaries are love wearing work boots. Forgiveness is not letting anger choose your route. And honor, real honor, doesn't always salute. Sometimes it simply refuses to go back. It was late September when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was a Virginia area code I didn't recognize. I was halfway through polishing a report for command review, half listening to the hum of the ceiling fan. The voice on the other end was quiet but firm. "Commander Carter, this is Pastor Lewis." My heart slowed. The air in the room thickened. "Yes, Pastor," I said carefully. "It's been a while." He hesitated, then said, "Your father's in the hospital, heart failure. He's stable for now, but it's serious." For a moment, I said nothing. I'd imagined this call before, on bad nights, when anger blurred with pity, when I pictured him old and regretful. But imagining something and hearing it were two different wars. "What hospital?" I asked. "St. Mary's in Richmond." "I'll come," I said automatically. When we hung up, I sat still for a long time. David found me like that, hands on my knees, staring at nothing. "Who was it?" "The pastor," I said. "Dad's sick." He looked at me cautiously. "Do you want me to come?" I shook my head. "No, this one I need to do alone." The drive to Richmond took 3 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the tires hum against the asphalt, to the sound of my own breathing. The autumn trees blurred into streaks of gold and rust, like the world had decided to dress up for something solemn. When I reached the hospital, the air smelled of antiseptic and thyme. A nurse led me down a long corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, too bright, too clean. My mother was there, sitting in the corner of the room, clutching a paper cup of coffee gone cold. She looked smaller than I remembered, like grief had been pressing on her shoulders for years. When she saw me, her eyes widened. "Emily." "Hi, Mom."
She stood but didn't know whether to hug me or apologize. In the end, she just reached out and touched my sleeve. A mother's compromise between love and fear. "He's asleep," she said. "He doesn't know you're here yet." I nodded. "That's okay." I turned toward the bed. My father looked pale, almost translucent under the harsh lights. The tubes, the monitors, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, they all made him look small, too human. For a long moment, I just stood there. This was the man who'd built fences and rules and hierarchies. The man who taught me to salute before I ever wore a uniform. The man who once told me tears were what happens when weak people run out of words. Now he was quiet, and I had no words either. That night, I stayed in a nearby motel. The air conditioner rattled like it was haunted, and I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling. Around midnight, my mother called. "He's awake," she whispered. "He asked for you." I was there within 15 minutes. When I walked into the room, he looked up. His voice was thin but clear. "Didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. He gave a faint nod. Figures. We stared at each other. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a war neither had wanted to fight. Finally, he said, "You still in uniform?" "Always," I replied. He chuckled weakly. "Knew you'd make something of yourself. I just didn't know it'd be so far away from us." "You pushed me far, Dad." He looked away. "I was trying to make you strong." "You did," I said softly, "but you also made me lonely." That silenced him. The monitors beeped steadily, filling the gap between us. After a while, he said, "I never hated you, you know." "I know. I just didn't know how to love someone I couldn't control." Those words, raw, clumsy, human, broke something open in me. I sat down beside the bed and took his hand. The same hand that once slapped the table when I said I'd join the Navy. The same hand that held a hammer to build that fence all those years ago. "You don't have to control me anymore," I whispered. "You just have to rest." He nodded, eyes glassy with unshed tears. The next morning, I helped my mother fill out some hospital paperwork. She kept apologizing for things she didn't name. The police, the letters, the silence. "I should have stopped him," she said. "You couldn't," I said gently. "No one could. He had to stop himself." When she turned away to hide her tears, I slipped my father's old ring, the one he wore when teaching, off the table and held it. It was scratched, dull, and heavy. A nurse walked in. "Commander Carter," she said softly, recognizing me from my badge. "He told us you were military. He's been telling stories about you to the staff." "Stories?" I asked. She smiled. "Said his daughter's tougher than half the Navy. Said she makes him proud." I didn't cry right then, but when I stepped into the hallway, I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and let the weight of that word settle. Proud. That evening, before I drove back to Norfolk, I went to see him one more time. He was half asleep, pale, but peaceful. He opened one eye. "Leaving already?" "I'll come back," I said. "Don't bother if I don't make it," he murmured. "I've said my piece." I smiled faintly. "You'll make it. You're too stubborn to quit now." He smirked, a ghost of the old him. "You get that from me." "Maybe," I said, "but I learned grace from Mom." He nodded, closing his eyes. "That's good. You'll need both." The drive home was long and quiet. Halfway back, I pulled over near a small roadside chapel, one of those white-painted country churches that look like they're holding secrets. I walked in, sat in the last pew, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me show up before it was too late." I didn't know if I was talking to God, to fate, or to the part of myself that had stayed angry for too long. Maybe all three. When I walked out, the sun was rising. I drove the rest of the way home in its light. David was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "How was it?" "Hard," I said, "but right."
He nodded. That's usually how the right things feel. We sat together watching the sky brighten. For the first time in years, the silence between me and my father didn't echo. It simply ended. Spring returned to Norfolk the following year, soft and golden. The dogwoods bloomed early, and the base was alive again with new recruits, all nerves, all energy, all faith that hard work could fix anything. I saw myself in their faces. I also saw how wrong I'd been once, to think strength meant isolation. It had been 6 months since my father's passing. He'd made it through the winter, long enough for one last conversation, a goodbye disguised as small talk. He'd passed quietly at home with my mother holding his hand. She called me just after sunrise. Her voice was calm, almost formal. "He's gone, Emily. He said he loved you." I'd been at the harbor then, watching a destroyer glide out to sea. I remember the smell of diesel and salt, the gulls cutting through the gray morning. When the call ended, I just stood there and whispered, "Fair winds, Dad." I didn't cry. Not then. The funeral was small, as he wanted. I wore my navy dress whites at my mother's request. Some relatives didn't meet my eyes. Others did, with something like shame or gratitude. I didn't need either. I just stood at attention when the chaplain spoke and listened as they played taps. After the ceremony, I helped my mother into her car. She looked fragile, like the past year had aged her a decade. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I had to," I replied. "He taught me to show up, even when it hurts." She nodded. "He was proud of you. You know, he just didn't know how to say it." "I know," I said. "I said it for both of us." We hugged, really hugged, for the first time in years. A month later, a small package arrived at my door. Inside was an envelope labeled, "To Emily from Dad." The handwriting was weak but unmistakable. Each letter pressed too hard, as if he were carving the words into the paper. "Emily, if you're reading this, I probably ran out of time. I don't know how to apologize properly. I always thought apologies made a man look small. But maybe small is where forgiveness starts. You were right to stand your ground. You were right to walk away. I tried to raise you strong. You ended up stronger than I could handle. I called the cops because I couldn't call myself out. Tell your husband I respect him. He stood by you the way I should have. You'll do better than I did. That's what every parent should want. Dad." The letter smelled faintly of motor oil from his workshop, I guessed. I read it 3 times, then folded it back and set it in my desk drawer next to my medals. Not above them, not beneath them, beside them, equal. That summer, life began again in small, ordinary ways. My mother started calling every Sunday evening, just to talk. She asked about David's work, about the new recruits, about my garden. Her laughter softened over the phone, lighter, freer. One evening she said, "I think he'd be happy seeing us like this." "I think so too," I said. David and I started hosting barbecues for our neighbors. Sometimes when the grill smoked and kids ran through the yard with sparklers, I'd catch myself looking up, half expecting to see my father leaning against the fence, a beer in hand, pretending not to smile. The ache didn't go away, but it changed. It became quieter, gentler, less a wound, more a weathered scar that told me I'd survived something important. One Saturday, I was invited to speak at a local high school's graduation. The principal introduced me as Commander Emily Carter, Navy SEAL and hometown daughter. The applause startled me. When I stepped up to the podium, the gym smelled of flowers and floor wax. I looked out at the rows of faces, bright, hopeful, terrified of what comes next. And I thought of my father watching me once from a folding chair in that same gym. I took a breath. "When I was your age," I began, "I thought respect came from titles, medals, achievements. I was wrong. It comes from how you treat people, especially when they've stopped treating you well. Some of you will leave home and find that the people who should have loved you most didn't know how. Don't carry that anger forever. It gets heavy. Learn to set it down, even if they never ask you to, because forgiveness isn't letting them win, it's letting yourself rest. The room was quiet. A few parents nodded. A girl in the front row wiped her eyes. I smiled and said, "And call your mothers. They worry more than you think." The laughter that followed felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night, I stood on the porch again, coffee in hand, watching the streetlights flicker on. David joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "You spoke well today," he said. "Thanks," I said. "I just told them what I wish someone had told me sooner." He nodded toward the sky. "Your dad would have liked that speech." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe he would have told me to shorten it." We both laughed. Then I whispered, almost to myself, "I think he finally heard me, wherever he is." David squeezed my shoulder. "You think he's proud now?" "Yeah," I said, "and so am I." A week later, I found myself back at the church where I had once married, with no family in the pews. This time it was filled with friends, colleagues, neighbors. One of my recruits was getting married, and she'd asked me to give her away since her father couldn't attend. As the music started, I walked her down the aisle. She whispered, "I'm nervous." I smiled, "Then you're doing it right." When we reached the altar, she squeezed my hand. "Thank you for showing up." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Thank you for showing up. That's all I'd ever wanted from my father, from anyone. And now I understood. Sometimes the way you heal is by being the person you once needed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood alone outside the church. The sky burned gold and pink, the same colors that had framed my own wedding day years ago. I whispered into the fading light, "I forgive you, Dad, and I forgive myself, too." Then I turned and walked toward the car where David waited, the future open like a calm sea. If someone once made you feel invisible at your own table, I hope you still save them a seat, not for their sake, but for yours. Because sometimes the greatest act of revenge isn't silence or distance or strength, it's peace. And peace, my friends, takes courage too.